Mr. Speaker, that was truly awful. It was like watching My Sky in half speed. You know, I found myself desperate to change the channel, but under Labor you're only allowed to watch one channel. That's the way it goes, Mr. Speaker. That contribution from the Leader of the Opposition was a contribution he made after he recently returned from his economic fact-finding mission to North Korea, Mr. Speaker. You see, I thought that was gone of the days where a Labor leader no longer wanted New Zealand to be a Polish shipyard. But in fact, it's quite the contrary. Mr. Shearer yearns for New Zealand to be a Polish shipyard. But I got a bit of bad news for Mr. Shearer. Firstly, Poland has already moved to partial privatisations. They've abandoned the single buyer of electricity, and by the way, they've got a convention centre, Mr. Speaker. But anyway, credit where credit is due. The Labor Party has finally adopted one of the very sensible policies of the national government, and that is the mixed ownership model. That's right. These days, the Labor Party is 51% owned by Labor and 49% owned by the Greens. Yes, Mr. Speaker, these two parties have come together in this happy little place where fruit meets loot. That's where they go. That's where they are, Mr. Speaker. And like the famous combinations of all time, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. It's Sherlock Shearer and Dr. Norman in search of solving the mystery. And this one is the Hound of Baskervilles, Mr. Speaker, where, according to them, Bill English is the devil beast that haunts the moors that New Zealand live on. Sadly for our two would-be crime solvers, it turns out that the devil beast is not only a thoroughly competent Minister of Finance, he is the envy of the Western world, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, far from being someone who wants to haunt the moors, he wants to build tens of thousands of homes well insulated and affordable on the moors, Mr. Speaker. And he's got this funny, quaint little notion. He wants New Zealand to earn money, not to print it. That's the way he wants to go. Mr. Speaker, he wants to support enterprise. He does not want to regulate for monopoly. He is a man who supports businesses, big and small. He is a person who cares about individuals, rich and poor, and that was on display in his budget here today, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, like all great Sherlock Holmes mystery, there is a twist in the tale, and the twist is as simple as this. The devil beast is the opposition, not the Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, let's have a little history lesson, because you didn't get any of that in David Shearer's speech. We came into government in late 2008. This is the fifth budget that has been delivered by a national government and by Bill English. It is a sensible and thoughtful budget, and I do want to start by thanking the government's support partners, John Banks and the ACT Party, Peter Dunn, United Future, and of course Tariana Turia and Peter Sharples and the Maori Party, who've worked hard for solid, stable, progressive government in this country. But, Mr. Speaker, let's put a bit of a reality check into this debate. And they've got their heads down because they don't want to acknowledge the facts, Mr. Speaker. They've got their heads down because they don't want to know what really happened. We came in late 2008 and the Treasury said to us, this is what's happening. There is a global financial crisis. Actually, it turned out to be the worst crisis since the Great Depression. That's what happened. We came in and inherited basically a decade of mismanagement by the previous Labor government and wasteful spending they could not afford. We came into office when economists were saying the unemployment rate would rise to 10 or maybe 11%. And all of that happened before the Christchurch earthquakes, which we now know cost the economy overall north of $40 billion. That was before there were droughts and before there were floods and before there was a recession so deep that it claimed yet another victim in Europe earlier this year in the form of Cyprus. So, Mr. Speaker, what does Budget 2013 tell us? It tells us this government and this country will be back in surplus by 2014-15. And actually, next year, the deficit will be under 1% of GDP. This is a country that will have a deficit of $2 billion. If no one noticed, a couple of days ago in Australia, they announced a budget deficit of $20 billion, and they have had commodity prices rising much faster than we've had in New Zealand. But, Mr. Speaker, it gets a little more interesting than that, because when we came in, and they know it, that's why they're looking in their books, because they're trying to work out where they went wrong. The Treasury came in and said, this is the way it is. This is the way it is. A decade of deficits, you'll never be back in surplus. Debt to GDP in this country will be 60% by 2020. What does Budget 2013 tell us? Under the economic leadership of Bill English, this country will be back to having a debt to GDP of 20%, not 60%, 20%. So when David Shearer says Bill English and the national government doesn't care about the people of New Zealand, well, guess what? We care enough to make sure that they don't have an additional $60 or $70 billion worth of debt around their neck. That's how much we care. Mr. Speaker, we care enough to ensure that we've now got an unemployment rate which is 6.2%, the 11th lowest in the developed world. Mr. Speaker, we have a growth rate that was 3% last year and predicted to be 2.5%, 3%. We have an inflation rate under 1%, and we have interest rates on 50-year lows. And Mr. Shearer had the audacity to get up and try and argue that under a Labour government, New Zealanders got more money. Well, no, they didn't. It all went away in inflation, the whole lot. They paid interest rates twice as much as they're under this government. They went backwards, and the only reason they could finance their wild spending patterns were because New Zealanders borrowed tens of billions of dollars. The party's over, and it's New Zealanders that are having to pay back because they didn't get any progress under a Labour-led government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you didn't hear David Shearer saying what external analysts think of this national-led government. Not a word, not a peep, not a sound out of him about what the rest of the world's saying. That's because when Christine Lagarde, the chief executive of the IMF, came out and said, I like what this government's doing, this government's getting the big issues under control, not a word from David Shearer about that. Mr. Speaker, the week before last, something pretty interesting happened. Standard & Poor's said this country is the 9th least risky country in the world to hold government debt, and the 9th least risky, Mr. Speaker. That doesn't sound like failure to me. So let's just take a moment to talk about some of these policies, Mr. Speaker. Let's go to housing. Let's go to housing. I mean a real solution to housing. Not some illusion that is purported by people who started at one position, said something was affordable and they'd deliver at one rate, backtracked within 5 minutes before they could get anywhere near there. No, Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about a real comprehensive solution. So what has the government announced today? Well, let's see. OK, let's talk about that then. So now we're going to have a national-led government that, with the support of the Auckland Council, will produce 39,000 new dwellings, real dwellings, in the next 3 years. Way above what's currently being delivered. Mr. Speaker, social housing, helping people in need. Labor reckoned they cared about those people, but they didn't care enough to insulate their homes. They didn't care enough to make sure there wasn't mould on the walls. They didn't care enough to make sure they were actually upkept. They just said, we'll come into the parliament and tell people we've built a few more houses, and the fact that 70,000 people are living in homes which are not fit to live in because they don't care enough about them, we'll just forget about all of that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this week This government announced Project 324. You didn't hear that from David Shearer, but this government stood up and said we'll be building 2,000 extra bedrooms on existing houses in Auckland that will help ensure larger families have more accommodation so that issues of overcrowding and rheumatic fever can be dealt with. It's hundreds of millions of dollars. This government cares about all New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government, when it came to the issue of insulation, didn't just talk about it. Oh, they had plenty of money to spend on all sorts of wasteful things, but when it came to New Zealanders being warm, oh, they didn't care about that. 9 years in government, basically nothing. This government, 230,000 homes insulated in 4.5 years. And what's more, $100 million in this budget, with the support of the Maori Party, going out to the most at-risk families in New Zealand, 46,000 extra homes to be insulated. But oh no, that didn't get a mention from David Shearer because he doesn't want to admit to those families that actually a national-led government cares about all New Zealanders, cares about all of them, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, if we want to talk about home ownership, the fastest way to ensure someone can afford a home is to make sure that they can afford their mortgage. And to do that, you need good fiscal management. You need to make sure inflation is under control. You need to make sure that interest rates are low. Mr. Speaker, this was a budget that cared about growth. $158 million into tourism, attracting more tourists from new emerging markets like Latin America, Indonesia, China, Mr. Speaker. High-end tourists coming for business. Tourists coming to a convention centre, Mr. Speaker. Convention centre. So let's just talk about that convention centre. That's right. Labor had 9 years where they sat around and did very little. Oh, that's right. No, they did do one thing. They built a convention centre paid for by 230 pokie machines that Helen Clark went out and opened, and they all celebrated because of the economic measures. But oh, when National gets one, that by the way is 3 times larger and a way better deal, it's an outrage. An outrage. I'll tell you what, Helen Clark will come to the opening of this one if she's in town because she knows it's good for the economy. She knows it's good for New Zealand, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hundreds of millions of dollars in this budget pumped into science and innovation. The Callaghan Innovation Centre right across New Zealand, $200 million over 4 years into science and innovation, more money for R&D grants, for national science challenges and for Marsden. Mr. Speaker, let's move to the mixed ownership model. And what a success the float of Mighty River Power was. What a success. All this nonsense that New Zealand's given some asset away, New Zealand has given New Zealanders a chance to invest. Majority control has been retained by the Crown. It's called the same model that, by the way, Air New Zealand's been operating on, established under a Labour government, which they never ever campaigned to buy back the bit they didn't own, even in the 2011 election, Mr. Speaker. Mighty River Power has more retail investors in it than any other stock on the New Zealand exchange. And where do we want those New Zealanders to invest? Well, I say New Zealand. I say New Zealand. David Shearer wants them to invest in Australia. He wants them to invest in other markets. He doesn't want to invest in New Zealand. And the doozy of all of his statements in his speech came when he said, oh, by the way, the accounts are going to get worse because the government won't be getting the dividends. Does he remember about 3 weeks ago he announced a policy with his mate there, Dr. Watson, that he's giving away the dividends. They won't be arriving in any form to a Labour-led government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, oh yeah, they talk tough about Mighty River Power, Meridian and the other shares. Well, they talk tough to the people of Christchurch who are getting a state-of-the-art hospital facility. No, that's all okay. That magically appears when Russell prints some money. That's all fine, doesn't really matter. What about the $50 million that's going into internet connections for our schools up and down the country so young learners can get internet connections? You won't see David Shearer or Grant Robinson going out to those schools saying, hey kids, you can just have dial-up, because that's what you get under a Labour-led government. It's like My Sky on half speed. Don't worry, because they won't mention that. Mr Speaker, you won't get the $80 million going to irrigation around New Zealand. Mr Speaker, there is a lot happening in this government. And if we look at health and education just for a moment, because they're critical issues. Health, this is a government that has delivered. This is a government that's hired 1,000 extra doctors, 2,000 extra nurses, more money for rheumatic fever, more money for maternity care, more elective surgical operations. This is a government that's spent health dollars well. This is a government that's gone out there and said, we care about that. This is a government that's also going out there saying, the most at-risk New Zealanders, we care about them. Insulation for their homes, making sure there's rheumatic fever. Yes, there will be some money for hungry kids. Yes, there will be money for better budgeting services. Yes, there will be a whiteware procurement policy that helps people out. Mr Speaker, this is a government that says to business, we will get on top of those ACC costs that you inherited under the mismanagement of Labour, and we'll cut them to the tune of $1.5 billion, Mr Speaker. And in education, we'll carry on the great work we've done of getting more kids into ECE, more kids into NCEA, making sure our schools have 21st century learning capability and literacy. Mr Speaker, let me finish with this. Budget 2013 shows that after 5 years of a centre-right government, this is what building a brighter future looks like, delivering for New Zealanders. And by the way, guess what happened today? That's right, the manufacturing numbers came out and the PMI index showed that the sector is expanding again, month after month after month. The only crisis, I tell you, it's not in the manufacturing sector, it's in the leadership of the Labour Party. But don't worry, because it's only 51% of the leadership. They got 49% over there with Russell. Mr Speaker, and speaking of Russell Norman, when the unemployment rate dropped to 6.2% from 6.8%, he said that's an epic failure. I'd hate to think what he thinks success is. Mr Speaker, it's as simple as this. The election will be fought in 2014 on the economy. As Bill Clinton once said, it's the economy, stupid. And they will be looking at a government that has managed to work its way through by making sure this country earns more money, doesn't have to borrow it or print it. This is a government that's delivered competitiveness to our economy. This is where real jobs are delivered, where real growth takes place. Mr Speaker, it will be about national versus the devil beast. Mr Speaker, I know who I'll be voting for, and it won't be the devil beast.
Order. 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 Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.